If you follow aviation in Canada, you've probably seen Flair Air's recent summer expansion with 8 new destinations and 13 new MAX aircraft. And you might also be wondering, why are they doing this? First, it's borderline impossible to start an airline in Canada. Porter is pretty much the only successful upstart this century. And secondly, there's the whole matter of the pandemic to deal with, where Canada sits at an incredible 2.2% vaccination rate. So it's not looking good. With this in mind, me and my friend Will decided this would be an interesting topic to explore. Disclaimer, we are not aviation experts, and we're university students who I guess had some time. So we looked into it, and we actually discovered some interesting things. So in this video, we'll explore what Flair Air is doing right, and how they could actually be positioned for success. Now, a bit of context before we really get into it. Air travel in Canada is dominated by two players, Air Canada and WestJet, and it's been this way for a while now. Flair is just the latest in a long line of attempts to try and break this arrangement. And I hope they succeed, because I'm tired of paying $500 to fly from Toronto to Vancouver. Alright, so this idea of Flair succeeding, we decided to look at it internally and externally. It's a good way to see the entire problem space, and it's important to look at both angles when talking about success, because you could have the most profitable internal business structure, but if there's no market demand, if there are no customers who are willing to buy what you're trying to sell, then you won't succeed either. Internally, we think that Flair has a structure that could lend itself very well to profitability. And this is important because profitability really is necessary for any successful business. So we could break down profitability into revenues minus costs, but that would be very mundane. So instead we identified two drivers that we think are more representative of the situation. First, Flair is a true ultra low cost carrier. And second, Flair is not an airline-in-airline, so they're not a subsidiary of some established player that's just trying to cut costs. If executed correctly, the ultra-low-cost carrier model is the most profitable airline strategy in existence. The three poster children for this strategy, that's Allegiant, Frontier, and Spirit, have consistently posted the highest operating margins for airlines in the US since 2011. That's when Spirit went public. So it's clear that the model works, and it works because of a maniacal focus on costs. To give you an example, Spirit posted a fuel-adjusted cost per available seat mile of 5.67 cents in the fourth quarter of 2019. And that was less than 60% of Delta's 11.21 cents, and Delta is considered to be one of the most profitable mainline carriers. So it's clear that the model works, and Flair, by all accounts, is trying to replicate it. In 2018, Flair had a cost per available seat mile of 11 cents. That's still a little too high for a true ULCC, but they made it a priority to decrease that, and at least they're on the right side of Air Canada and WestJet, who sit at around 13 or 14 cents per available seat mile. Another helpful fact is that there hasn't actually been a true ultra low-cost carrier in Canada before. Meltdowns like Zoom and Jetsco were actually of low-cost carriers and not ultra low-cost carriers. Yes, Canada does have problems. It's sparsely populated, the sector lengths are long, and landing fees are very high. But Flair doesn't have to achieve Spirit level costs. They just have to achieve costs that are cheap enough relative to Air Canada and WestJet. The ultra low-cost carrier model doesn't guarantee success, but Flair can't be dismissed because of it. In fact, their largest competitive threat might actually be a testament to the strength of that business model. WestJet launched their own low-cost carrier in 2018 called Swoop, and we'll discuss that in the next section. And we are on to our second driver. Now, the fact that Flair is not an airline-in-airline actually helps them succeed. Unpacking this statement first requires understanding what an airline-in-airline is, and then exploring how that affects profitability and success, or at least in the traditional sense. So here we've used airline-in-airline to refer to carriers that operate as a wholly owned subsidiary of another airline. The parent airline can have a varying degree of involvement, and this ranges from completely separate ventures like WestJet and Swoop to operations that almost seem like there's a bit of an identity crisis with Continental and Continental Light. With that out of the way, we can explore how an airline-in-airline structure actually hinders profitability. They tend to disrupt both parts of the profitability equation, costs and revenues. Legacy carriers have heavier cost structures, typically with labor and also with maintenance, things like that. And having this more expensive parent typically leads to having costlier children. There isn't one single explanation for this difference, but let's just use the example of labor. And that often always comes up because when an airline tries to pay their subsidiary, tries to pay their staff lower wages, issues always come up with the unions of both airlines, or at least the union of the parent airline. For example, Swoop has already experienced this antagonism. In 2018, a federal arbitrator ruled that the same union would represent WestJet and Swoop pilots. There's also the issue of an established network carrier limiting the potential revenue upside of their subsidiaries. Legacy airlines are painfully aware of the dangers of cannibalization. They've seen this with KLM Buzz and Shuttle by United. Those are just two examples. So ANAs, they might be discouraged from competing with their parents on mainline routes. In cases where subsidiaries do step in, like Swoop taking some of WestJet's routes into Toronto Pearson, that causes issues with labor unions that we mentioned earlier. So that's why airline subsidiaries tend to not be the most profitable and successful. But here's where it gets interesting, because a lot of times these subsidiaries aren't supposed to be successful in the traditional business sense of being an independently profitable company. To understand this, we have to look at the reasons that legacy carriers typically start subsidiaries for. First, it's to create a profitable business. Very rarely happens. Secondly, to weaken low-cost competition in key markets. An example is Delta's Song versus JetBlue. And third, to test low-cost business practices for eventual adoption in mainline operations. These objectives aren't mutually exclusive, but only one of them actually refers to running a profitable business. One study that examined this found that 77% of airline subsidiaries were started in direct response to low-cost carrier threats. And two extremely relevant examples for Flair are Air Canada's Zip and Tango subsidiaries. Tango was created to fend off Canada 3000, which was a pseudo low-cost carrier, but it also allowed Air Canada to experiment with cost-saving measures like fare unbundling, higher capacities on their planes, and using online ticketing. This was pre-2004, remember. A couple of things happened to Air Canada at that time. They went bankrupt, but they also proved the success of these cost-saving measures on Tango. So after the bankruptcy proceedings, they decided to just fold Tango's practices back into the mainline carrier and create a new fare class called Tango. And there you go. If you look at it in isolation, it looks like Tango failed. But to Air Canada, it succeeded. It allowed them to test out low-cost practices to eventually fold back into their carrier. Now Zip, that's the second one. Their goals were even less subtle. At that time, Air Canada was trying to fight WestJet on a lot of routes, and they were doing so by just simply price matching. They were losing a lot of money because they had a heavier cost structure. So the goal of Zip was not necessarily to make money, but it was just to lose less money than Air Canada. That was all they had to do to be successful. It didn't ultimately end that well for Air Canada, evidenced by the fact that WestJet is still around today. But for that short period of time when Zip was running, it was a success for Air Canada because they were losing less money on those routes that they were matching WestJet on. In both cases, Zip and Tango might have just been Trojan horses. But the point is, as airline-in-airline subsidiaries, they weren't supposed to succeed. And this is relevant to Flair because, first, they're not an airline subsidiary, so their goals are actually to survive and turn a profit independently. But second, their main competitor, Swoop, is an airline subsidiary. WestJet says that Swoop is genuinely supposed to fill that ultra low cost carrier market, but who knows, it could just be WestJet's Trojan horse, their attempt to drive down the cost of labor, forcing labor unions to renegotiate pay scales. That would be kind of ironic. Now, that's a very interesting topic, and maybe we'll make a video about that one day. So these two drivers, one, having a true ultra low cost carrier structure, and two, not being a subsidiary, together we think they help both sides of the profit equation. So those are the internal factors. Now we'll move to the external factors. If nobody wants to fly, or if people aren't allowed to fly, then it doesn't matter how efficient you are, you're not going to have any revenue coming in. Fortunately for Flair, we think that people do want to fly, and there's also some hidden effects of COVID that might actually be positive. First is this idea of there being latent demand for cheap air travel in Canada. Many estimates put the number at around 10 million price-sensitive Canadians that would fly with an ultra-low-cost carrier if one existed in Canada. We did some quick math to try and support this, first by breaking down the population of Canada into age ranges, looking at the population that would fly with an ultra-low-cost carrier, some heavy assumptions here, and then we just summed it up. Came out to around 10.5 million. So we think that 10 million passenger estimate is probably alright, and it was also made by people who actually do this for a living, so not us. And then a lot of estimates translate this 10 million passengers into around 50 aircraft, or enough to support 2 to 3 ultra low cost carriers. We try to back this up with our own math, assuming that these low cost carriers would fly high density 737s for around 12 hours a day, which is actually under Spirit's 12.7 hour daily utilization. And with sector lengths in Canada being perhaps around 2,000 kilometers and a 30-minute turnaround, came out to around 4 flights per day. We ended up with a number of 78 aircraft, which is higher than the 50 aircraft, so we're comfortable with that number. And again, it was made by people who do this for a living. Even with the 50 737s, that still provides plenty of demand for Flair, so that's a good thing. Our last driver on the external side talks about the positive effects of COVID-19, and we split this up into 3 sub-reasons. If you can't tell by now, I do like to split things up. The first sub-driver, if you will, is the idea of pent-up travel demand. When travel does return and restrictions are lifted, a lot of Canadians will have some disposable income and they'll want to travel. Various travel surveys indicate that upwards of 50% of Canadians are willing or actively planning to travel in 2021, and around 60% of them will be looking for bargains. Both of those factors are good things for Flair. Throw in the fact that international travel might not have recovered by then, and people will be looking for cheap domestic travel. That is basically Flair's summer expansion. They're launching like $59 flights to 18 domestic destinations. Cannot be positioned better to take advantage of this trend. The second benefit of COVID relates to the 737 MAX. It's no accident that they exclusively ordered the MAX. Sure, they burn 14% less fuel than the 737-800, but this was also the first North American order made through 777 partners of the 737 MAX since its grounding. You can infer that Flair definitely got a reasonable rate on these aircraft. For reference, many analysts believe that Europe's IAG received upfront discounts of over 60% for their order of 200 MAXs in mid-2019. Flair probably didn't receive such sweeteners, but you can expect a substantial discount, especially given the slowdown in demand from COVID. Finally, the best part of COVID for Flair is perhaps what it's done to Air Canada and WestJet. This is critical because these two airlines have played key roles in extinguishing upstarts, 2 most relevant examples being JetSco and CanJet. So JetSco was an attempt at a low-cost carrier, but they made the mistake of, to quote Professor from Rotman, JetSco's biggest mistake was trying to fight a price war without a war chest. WestJet just had more capital to outlast them. On the other hand, CanJet didn't try to actively fight a price war, but they made the mistake of focusing on Atlantic Canada, which just doesn't have a large enough market to support 3 players. Some estimates, perhaps biased because they were made by CanJet's parent company, peg WestJet and Air Canada for increasing the region's seat capacity by 10%. Eventually, CanJet switched to charter operations and they fizzled out. Fortunately for Flair, COVID-19 has absolutely hammered Air Canada and WestJet. Both airlines are operating just 20% of their typical networks compared to the first quarter of 2019. Now they're in survival mode, so they can't fight a price war with Flair right now. The pandemic might also give Flair the chance to move into key locations like Toronto or Vancouver, with Air Canada and WestJet actively scaling back their operations there. This would allow Flair to build up their ridership out of key markets and prove their value proposition to Canadians ahead of a potentially lucrative summer travel season. Although it's looking quite doubtful, so maybe it'll be a winter travel season. By the time Air Canada and WestJet regain their footing, it might be too late to fight a traditional fare war. We've described the 2 drivers of latent demand for cheap air travel in Canada and the positive effects of COVID-19. And we think that these drivers combine to create a favorable market environment. If we bring things back to our original framework, this completes our analysis. We've looked at the internal factors and external factors of what Flair is doing right. And hopefully, we painted a balanced picture of why they can succeed. Personally, I think anyone who has the courage to start an airline in Canada should be commended. In Flair's case, their ultra-low-cost carrier price point would be a welcome addition to the sky-high prices of WestJet and Air Canada. Everything we talked about in this video did originally come from an article that we wrote at our website, theflyingmoose.net. I'll definitely put a link somewhere. The motivation behind writing that article and making this video were to explore why Flair Air can win, or at least why they're not in imminent bankruptcy. This isn't to say that success is guaranteed. We've glossed over a lot of the issues with starting airlines in Canada. And also, Swoop could be a credible threat. Regardless of whether or not we're right, Flair has made the decision to go all in, and it's exciting to see.